On the western coast of the mainland, the largest island of the Orkney archipelago off the northern tip of Scotland, there is a bay called the Bay of Scarhill. The bay faces west, open to the full force of the North Atlantic, and on stormy days the waves that roll in from the open ocean break against the low cliffs and the sandy shore with a force that has been reshaping the coastline since the last ice age retreated and left the land to its own slow processes of change. The landscape here is characteristically Arcadian. Flat, treeless, windswept, the sky immense and fast-moving, the light shifting constantly between the brilliant clarity of a clear Orkney day and the dramatic darkness of an approaching Atlantic storm. In the winter of 1850, a storm more severe than the ordinary run of Orkney winters stripped the sand from a large dune on the shore of the bay and revealed, beneath the surface, the stone walls of a cluster of buildings. The storm did what no human investigation had managed to do. It uncovered, after approximately 5,000 years of burial, the remains of the oldest surviving village in Britain, a settlement that had been occupied by Neolithic farmers for more than 6 centuries before it was finally buried by the accumulating sand and abandoned to the processes of geological time. The village is called Skara Brae. Its 9 surviving structures, connected by covered passageways and built into and around a large midden of domestic waste that served both as building material and as insulation against the cold and wind, are among the best preserved examples of Neolithic domestic architecture anywhere in the world. The houses retain their internal fittings: stone shelving units built against the walls, stone box beds set into the walls, stone hearths at the center of each floor, stone storage containers sunk into the floor and lined with clay to make them waterproof. The inhabitants of Skara Brae did not have wood available for furniture in the treeless Orkney landscape, so they built everything from the one material that Orkney provided in abundance: the flat splitting sandstone that lies just beneath the surface of the ground throughout the archipelago and that can be worked into slabs and sheets and structural elements with a minimum of tools and a maximum of patience and knowledge. The age of Skara Brae is one of its most astonishing qualities. The village was occupied from approximately 3100 BCE to 2500 BCE, a period of roughly 6 centuries during which the same community appears to have lived in the same structures, gradually building up the midden that surrounded and eventually engulfed the buildings. This places the occupation of Skara Brae at approximately the same period as the earliest phases of construction at Stonehenge, several centuries before the Great Pyramids of Giza were built, and more than 2,000 years before the Romans arrived in Britain. The people who lived at Skara Brae were contemporaries of the earliest urban civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, inhabitants of a world that was simultaneously developing complex social organization in widely separated locations around the globe. But unlike those urban civilizations, the community of Skara Brae left no written records, no monumental architecture designed to express political power, no evidence of the kind of social hierarchy that the great river valley civilizations were developing. What they left was something rarer and in some ways more intimate: the actual physical contents of their daily lives, preserved by the accident of burial and the good fortune of Orkney's dry, sandy soil. The Bay of Scarhill faces directly west into the North Atlantic, and the specific quality of the light that arrives from that direction has a particular character that photographers and artists who have worked in Orkney frequently describe as unlike the light anywhere else in Britain. It comes from a great distance over open water, filtered by the atmosphere in a way that removes the haze that characterizes light over land, and it arrives at the surface of the bay with a clarity and a directness that makes every object it falls on appear sharply defined. In the evenings, when the sun descends toward the western horizon and the light enters at a low angle, the shadows are long and the stone surfaces of the ruins catch the light in a way that makes every carved edge and every joint between stones vivid and precise. Whoever lived at Skara Brae experienced this specific quality of light every day of their lives at the settlement, and whatever they thought or felt about it is beyond our knowledge. But the light itself is unchanged from what it was 5,000 years ago, one of the few things that connects the modern visitor directly and without mediation to the experience of the Neolithic inhabitants. The specific character of Orkney's isolation, which is today moderated by ferry services and regular flights, but that in the Neolithic period would have required the crossing of the Pentland Firth in small wooden or skin boats, may paradoxically have been one of the factors that contributed to the distinctive cultural fluorescence of Neolithic Orkney. Communities that are sufficiently isolated from the broader world to develop their own cultural traditions without constant external pressure tend to produce cultural forms that are more distinctively local and more intensively developed within their specific environmental conditions than communities in more central and more connected locations. The specific combination of isolation and internal connectivity, in which the communities of Orkney were sufficiently isolated from the British mainland to develop their own cultural tradition while being sufficiently well connected to each other across the archipelago to invest in shared ceremonial infrastructure, may be the key to understanding why Neolithic Orkney produced a cultural achievement of such exceptional character. The Neolithic period in Britain, the era of Skara Brae, was a time of profound transformation in the relationship between human beings and the land they inhabited, a transformation that began with the arrival of agriculture from continental Europe and that reshaped the ecological, social, and cultural landscape of Britain in ways whose effects are still visible today. The Mesolithic inhabitants of Britain, the hunter-gatherers who had colonized the island after the retreat of the last glaciers approximately 10,000 years ago, lived in small mobile groups that moved through the landscape in seasonal patterns following the available food resources. The red deer and wild boar of the woodlands, the fish and shellfish of the rivers and coasts, the hazelnuts and berries and roots of the forest floor. They left behind them a sparse archaeological record of flint tools, shell middens, and occasional hearths, evidence of a way of life that was adapted to the specific ecology of the post-glacial British landscape but that left few permanent marks on it. The arrival of farming communities from continental Europe, beginning around 4000 BCE, brought with it a fundamentally different relationship with the land. The Neolithic farmers cleared the forests to make fields, maintained herds of cattle and sheep on the cleared land, built permanent settlements and enclosures, and constructed the megalithic monuments, the long barrows and causewayed enclosures, and eventually the stone circles and henges that are the most visible surviving evidence of the period. The transformation of the landscape from the wooded post-glacial environment to the more open agricultural landscape that characterizes much of Britain today began in the Neolithic and was still underway during the occupation of Skara Brae. The specific character of Neolithic Orkney reflects both the general patterns of the Neolithic transformation and the specific environmental and social conditions of an island group on the extreme northwestern periphery of the farming revolution. Orkney was settled by farming communities sometime around 3500 BCE, and the settlers brought with them cattle and sheep and the knowledge of grain cultivation, transforming the treeless but fertile grasslands of the archipelago into one of the most productive agricultural environments of Neolithic Britain. The specific combination of rich soils, abundant marine resources, and the flat-splitting sandstone that served as a building material made Orkney an unusually productive and comfortable place for Neolithic communities, and the density of the Neolithic monuments that survive in Orkney, including not only Skara Brae but the Ring of Brodger, the Stones of Stenness, and the Maeshowe Chambered Tomb, suggests a population that was thriving and that invested substantial resources in the construction of communal monuments. The people of Skara Brae were farmers and pastoralists who kept cattle and sheep, grew small quantities of grain, and supplemented their diet extensively with the marine resources of the bay and the surrounding waters. They were also, the evidence suggests, connected to the broader Arcadian community through the exchange of goods and ideas, participants in a social world that extended beyond their immediate settlement to encompass the other communities of the archipelago and perhaps communities on the Scottish mainland beyond. The specific evidence for Neolithic trade and exchange networks, visible in the distribution of specific types of stone tools and pottery across wide geographic areas, suggests that the communities of Neolithic Britain were connected to each other through networks of exchange that moved goods, ideas, and probably people across distances that seem impressive given the transport technology available. The polished stone axes of the Neolithic period, some of which can be traced to specific quarry sites in Cumbria, Wales, and Cornwall, have been found hundreds of kilometers from their place of origin, evidence for exchange networks that connected communities across the full extent of Britain. The grooved ware pottery that may have originated in Orkney spread southward through Britain over the course of the 3rd millennium BCE, documenting the movement of a specific cultural tradition from the northern periphery to the core of the British Neolithic world. The people of Skara Brae were participants in this broader network, and their specific location at the far northwestern edge of the British Isles did not prevent them from being connected to developments in the wider world of the period. The specific role of the Orkney Islands in the broader story of Britain's transition to agriculture is one that archaeologists are still working out. The islands were apparently settled by farming communities relatively late in the British Neolithic sequence, perhaps around 3500 BCE, which places the initial settlement of Orkney several centuries after the establishment of farming communities in southern England and Ireland. But the rapidity with which Arcadian communities developed a distinctive and in some respects exceptional material culture, including the grooved ware pottery tradition, the specific architectural traditions of the chambered tombs and the stone houses, and the remarkable concentration of ceremonial monuments, suggests that the conditions of Orkney were in some ways particularly favorable for cultural innovation and investment in communal infrastructure. The architecture of Skara Brae is one of the most remarkable survivals from the Neolithic world, and the specific character of the buildings, the materials from which they were made, the organization of their internal spaces, and their relationship to each other and to the broader landscape of the site, tells a detailed story about the specific form of domestic life that the community practiced. The houses of Skara Brae are roughly square in plan, with rounded corners and walls of dry stone construction that in some cases still stand to a height of more than 2 meters. They are not large. The interior living spaces of the houses range from approximately 35 to 40 square meters, about the size of a small modern apartment, and the low walls and the thick midden deposits that surrounded them would have created a dark, warm, sheltered environment very different from the exposed and windswept surface of the Arcadian landscape above. The decision to build into the midden rather than on top of the ground was a practical one, because the accumulated organic waste of the community provided both structural support for the stone walls and thermal insulation that would have made the interiors significantly warmer than the Orkney winter would otherwise have allowed. The internal organization of each house follows a remarkably consistent pattern across the settlement, a consistency that suggests either a strongly shared cultural convention about how domestic space should be organized or a degree of centralized planning that is unusual for a settlement of this scale and period. Each house has a central rectangular hearth, slightly off-center toward the front of the house, whose position as the source of heat and light made it the functional center of the domestic space. Against the back wall, opposite the entrance, stands the most prominent piece of stone furniture, the dresser, a construction of 2 stone shelves supported by stone uprights that faces the entrance, and that would have been the first thing visible to anyone entering the house. The dresser has attracted particular attention from archaeologists and from visitors to the site because its position and its scale give it the character of a focal point or display space rather than simply a storage shelf. The specific objects that the dresser might have displayed, whether practical tools and vessels or objects of symbolic and social significance, are not known, but the deliberate prominence given to this piece of furniture in the consistent layout of the houses suggests that it served a function that went beyond the purely practical. On either side of the hearth, set into the walls, are the stone box beds, rectangular enclosures of stone that would have held organic bedding material and provided a defined sleeping space for the inhabitants. The beds on the right side of the house as one enters are slightly larger than those on the left, a consistent difference across the settlement that has been interpreted as reflecting a gender distinction in sleeping arrangements, with the larger bed on the right reserved for the male head of household. The stone walls of the Skara Brae houses, built in the dry stone tradition using flat-splitting Arcadian sandstone without mortar, represent a specific masonry tradition that was developed to exploit the particular character of the local stone and that produced structures of surprising durability. The sandstone of Orkney splits naturally along horizontal planes, producing slabs of relatively consistent thickness that can be stacked to form walls without the need for mortar and that can be cut and shaped with stone tools to produce the specific architectural elements required for the construction of the houses and their furniture. The skill required to produce the consistent and level wall courses visible at Skara Brae, and to construct the precisely fitted box beds and dressers that furnish the houses, was not a simple or intuitive craft, but a developed tradition of architectural stoneworking that required both technical knowledge and considerable practical experience. The quality of the stoneworking at Skara Brae is in many respects comparable with the quality of the masonry in the great ceremonial monuments of Neolithic Orkney, and it reflects the same community's mastery of the specific architectural possibilities of the local stone. The roofs of the Skara Brae houses are among the most debated aspects of the settlement's architecture, because no roofing material has survived and the specific character of the roof construction must be inferred from indirect evidence. The stone walls of the houses corbel inward slightly as they rise, in a way that is consistent with a corbelled stone roof of the type used in the chambered tombs of the period. But whether this corbelling was sufficient to support a complete stone roof or whether the houses were roofed with a combination of stone corbelling and organic material such as turf or thatch is uncertain. The presence of organic roofing material would explain the relatively low maximum height of the surviving walls, which are not tall enough to support a corbelled stone vault over the full span of the house interiors, and it would be consistent with the use of turf and other organic materials in building construction that is well documented in later Scottish vernacular architecture. The question of the roof is significant for understanding the thermal and acoustic environment of the interior spaces, since a stone roof and a turf roof would have different properties in terms of insulation, weight-bearing, and the transmission of sound. The stone furniture of Skara Brae is the element of the site that most immediately and most powerfully bridges the gap between the modern visitor and the Neolithic inhabitants, because it provides a physical setting for daily life that is recognizable in its basic organization even across 5,000 years of cultural change. The dresser, the beds, the hearth, the storage containers. These are the basic elements of domestic life, and their presence in the Skara Brae houses gives the ruins a quality of habitation that most archaeological sites lack. Standing at the entrance to one of the Skara Brae houses and looking in at the dresser facing you from the far wall, with a hearth in the middle of the floor and the box beds to either side, it is possible to imagine the specific quality of life that was lived in this space with a vividness that purely intellectual knowledge of the period does not permit. The scale is right for human habitation. The organization is logical. The materials, though unusual in their uniformity, serve the functions of furniture adequately. The house feels, in a way that very few Neolithic structures feel, like a place where people actually lived. The stone storage containers sunk into the floors of some of the houses provide evidence for specific economic activities of the community. The containers were lined with clay to make them waterproof, a detail that suggests they were used to store liquids or to keep materials damp. The most plausible interpretation is that they were used to store limpets, the shellfish that are abundant in the Bay of Scaril and that were a significant component of the diet at Skara Brae, either as food themselves or, more likely, as bait for line fishing in the bay. The scale of the limpet remains in the midden deposits suggests that the collection and processing of limpets was a substantial activity at the settlement, and the specific infrastructure of the floor tanks provides a material context for understanding how this activity was integrated into the domestic economy of the household. The hearths of the houses provide evidence for another essential aspect of daily life, the management of fire in a landscape with very limited fuel sources. Orkney is treeless, and the fuels available to the Skara Brae community for their hearths would have been primarily peat, animal dung, and whatever driftwood washed up on the shore of the bay. The specific character of the ash and charcoal deposits in the Skara Brae hearths, analyzed by environmental archaeologists, confirms the use of peat as the primary fuel, a fuel that burns slowly and produces a characteristic dense smoke that would have permeated the interiors of the houses and contributed to the specific sensory environment of life at the settlement. The specific darkness of the Skara Brae house interiors is one of the aspects of daily life at the settlement that modern visitors, accustomed to electric lighting, may find most difficult to imagine. The houses had no windows in the modern sense, and the primary source of interior lighting would have been the hearth fire, supplemented perhaps by oil lamps, of which several stone examples have been found at the site. The quality of light produced by a peat fire in a low-ceiling stone room is warm and flickering, adequate for the close work of food preparation and craft production, but limiting for activities that require precise vision at a distance. The social and sensory implications of spending the long Orkney winter evenings, when darkness comes early and lasts long, in the relatively dim interior of a stone house lit by a peat fire, are significant. Conversation, storytelling, craft work, and the shared maintenance of the domestic fire would have structured the evening hours in ways that have no modern equivalent. The acoustic quality of the stone interior, which would have amplified and reflected the sounds of the fire and of the voices of the inhabitants, would have given the evening hours a specific intimate character unlike the experience of any modern domestic environment. The specific challenges of cooking in the Skara Brae environment, without the benefit of metal vessels or ceramic containers that could be placed directly on a fire, required the development of cooking techniques adapted to the available materials. The use of ceramic vessels, which were available to the Skara Brae community in the form of grooved ware pottery, would have allowed liquid cooking in pots suspended over or placed near the fire. But the specific ceramic evidence from the site, which includes large flat-based vessels of the type characteristic of grooved ware, is more consistent with use as serving and storage vessels than as cooking pots in the modern sense. Stone boiling, in which water is heated by adding hot stones that have been warmed in the fire, is a cooking technique documented ethnographically among many hunter-gatherer and early farming communities and may have been used at Skara Brae for the preparation of soups and stews. The specific evidence for cooking techniques at the site is limited, but the combination of ceramic vessels, hearthstones, and the bone evidence for the types and ages of animals consumed provides a basis for reconstructing the broad outlines of the community's culinary practices. The midden that surrounds and connects the buildings of Skara Brae is one of the most important sources of archaeological evidence for the daily life of the community, because the accumulated waste of several centuries of occupation preserves a detailed record of what the inhabitants ate, what they made, and how they disposed of the materials they no longer needed. A midden is, in essence, a garbage dump, but in the context of Skara Brae it is a garbage dump of extraordinary archaeological richness. The organic material preserved in the midden includes the bones of the animals that the community kept and consumed, the shells of the shellfish they collected, the charred remains of the plant foods they ate, and the discarded material culture of their daily lives. The analysis of these materials has allowed archaeologists to reconstruct the diet and subsistence economy of Skara Brae in considerable detail. The faunal remains from the midden are dominated by cattle and sheep bones, confirming the primarily pastoral character of the settlement's economy. The cattle were apparently kept primarily for their secondary products, milk and labor, rather than slaughtered primarily for meat, because the age profile of the cattle remains shows that animals were kept to relatively mature ages before being killed. The sheep, by contrast, appear to have been slaughtered at younger ages, suggesting that they were kept more specifically for their meat. The marine resources represented in the midden include large quantities of limpet shells, as well as the bones of fish species that would have been caught in the bay and the surrounding waters, including cod and scythe and various flat fish. The plant remains from Skara Brae are less abundant than the animal remains, partly because plant materials are less well preserved in the midden deposits and partly because the Arcadian climate and soil conditions are not ideal for the preservation of carbonized plant remains. The cereals identified from the site include emmer wheat and 6-row barley, both of which are documented at Neolithic sites across Britain and were the principal grain crops of the period. The relatively small quantities of cereal remains recovered from Skara Brae compared with the abundant pastoral evidence suggest that grain cultivation was a minor component of the settlement's food economy, with the primary calories coming from animal products and marine resources. The artifact assemblage recovered from the midden and from the floors and deposits of the houses is rich enough to give a detailed picture of the crafts practiced at the settlement. The most abundant category of artifact is the flint tool, primarily scrapers and knife-like cutting tools that were used in the processing of animal hides and food materials. Bone tools are also abundant, including needles and awls that document the production of leather and textiles. The presence of stone balls of various sizes, some carefully shaped and incised with decorative patterns, has been one of the more puzzling categories of artifact from the site, because their specific function is unknown and their distribution across Neolithic Orkney suggests that they had a significance beyond the purely functional. The decorated stone balls found at Skara Brae belong to a broader tradition of carved stone ball production that is found throughout Neolithic Scotland, with examples known from sites ranging from the Orkneys to the Shetlands and southward into mainland Scotland. The total number of known carved stone balls from Scotland runs into the hundreds, and they have been found in a variety of contexts including domestic sites, burial monuments, and as isolated finds with no clear archaeological context. The consistent care taken in their production, which involved the selection of appropriate stone types, the careful shaping of the ball, and the application of decorative patterns that show considerable skill and attention, suggests that they were objects of significance within the communities that produced them, even if the nature of that significance cannot be recovered from the physical evidence alone. The distribution of carved stone balls across a wide area of Scotland, including communities on the mainland as well as in Orkney, suggests that their production and exchange was part of the same network of cultural connection that linked the grooved ware pottery tradition to communities across the British Isles. The specific context in which grooved ware pottery was used at Skara Brae is not fully established, but the large size of many of the vessels and their flat-based, bucket-like form suggests uses that go beyond simple food storage and transport. The specific decorative traditions of grooved ware, which include applied cordons, incised geometric designs, and the use of a distinctive range of decorative motifs that are consistent across a wide geographic area, document a shared aesthetic tradition that was maintained across the extent of the grooved ware distribution zone. The fact that this decorative tradition was consistent enough to be recognizable as grooved ware across a vast geographic area, from Orkney to southern England, suggests either a high degree of cultural contact between communities producing the pottery in different areas or the movement of potters themselves between communities. The role of ceramic exchange in the social networks of Neolithic Britain is one of the more productive areas of current research, and Skara Brae's position as one of the earliest sites to produce grooved ware gives it a special significance in the ongoing discussion of this tradition's origins and spread. The social organization of the Skara Brae community, the specific relationships between households and the way in which the settlement functioned as a social unit beyond the level of individual domestic groups, is one of the questions that the archaeological evidence addresses only indirectly, but that the specific character of the site's architecture and layout helps to illuminate. The 9 houses of Skara Brae are connected by covered passageways, an architectural feature that is unusual for Neolithic settlements and that has been interpreted as evidence for a specific form of community integration in which the different domestic units of the settlement were linked by a network of communication and movement that facilitated interaction and cooperation between households. The passageways are not simply corridors between separate buildings but are architectural features of the settlement as a whole, covered by the midden material that also insulates the roofs of the buildings and creating a semi-subterranean network of movement through the settlement that would have been protected from the worst of the Orkney weather. The remarkable uniformity of the house plans at Skara Brae, in which each house follows the same basic layout with the dresser facing the entrance, the hearth in the center, and the box beds to either side, suggests a strong cultural convention about the proper organization of domestic space that was shared across the entire community. This uniformity is consistent with a small, closely integrated community in which the norms of domestic life were maintained through shared tradition and social consensus, and it contrasts with the variability that might be expected if the houses had been built at different times by families with different resources and different cultural preferences. The question of whether Skara Brae was occupied by a single extended family group or by several separate family units is one that the evidence does not definitively resolve. The size of the individual houses, each of which could comfortably accommodate a nuclear family of 4 to 6 people, and the number of houses in the settlement, which at its maximum appears to have been around 8 to 10 structures, suggest a total population of perhaps 50 to 100 people at the settlement at any given time. This scale is consistent with either a single extended kin group or with several related nuclear families operating as a cooperative community. The covered passageways and the shared organization of domestic space suggest a high degree of community integration that goes beyond the simple co-location of independent households. The degree of cooperation implied by the construction and maintenance of the midden as a shared resource, the covered passageways as shared infrastructure, and the community's collective investment in the elaborate monument complex at the Ness of Brodger just a few kilometers away suggests a level of social organization that we tend not to associate with small-scale Neolithic communities, but that Orkney's specific circumstances and resources appear to have made possible. The Ness of Brodger excavations, which have been ongoing since 2003 and which represent one of the most significant archaeological projects in Britain in recent decades, have transformed the understanding of the scale and complexity of Neolithic Orkney society. The large stone buildings revealed at the Ness of Brodger, some of them measuring 15 meters or more in length and constructed with a quality of masonry that equals or exceeds that of the domestic houses at Skara Brae, represent a type of Neolithic architecture that was previously unknown in Britain. The specific function of these buildings, whether they were used for feasting, for ceremony, for storage, or for some combination of purposes, is still being debated, but the scale of the cattle bone deposits associated with them suggests large-scale communal feasting events that brought together people from across the archipelago. The discovery of elaborate painted plaster on the interior walls of some of the Ness of Brodger structures is particularly remarkable, evidence for a tradition of interior decoration that adds a visual dimension to the picture of Neolithic Orkney that the plain stone walls of Skara Brae alone do not suggest. The social hierarchy of Neolithic Orkney, if there was one, is one of the aspects of the community's life that the archaeological evidence does not document directly. The uniformity of the house plans at Skara Brae, in which each house appears to have been built to the same basic specification without the variation in size or elaboration that typically marks differences in social status in the domestic architecture of more complex societies, is sometimes taken as evidence for a relatively egalitarian social organization. But the uniformity of the houses does not necessarily indicate the absence of social hierarchy. It may instead reflect a cultural convention in which differences of status were expressed through personal ornaments, control of specific resources, or leadership roles in communal activities rather than through the physical elaboration of the domestic environment. The specific types of evidence that would document social hierarchy in a non-literate society, written records, elaborate burials with differential goods, administrative records of tribute or taxation, are absent from Skara Brae, and the question of how power and authority were organized within the community remains genuinely open. The broader landscape of Neolithic Orkney, within which Skara Brae was embedded, is one of the most densely monumentalized Neolithic landscapes in the world, and the relationship between the domestic site of Skara Brae and the ceremonial monuments of the archipelago provides important context for understanding the social and spiritual life of the community. The heart of Neolithic Orkney, the UNESCO World Heritage designation that encompasses Skara Brae together with the Ring of Brodger, the stones of Stonehenge, and the Maeshowe chambered tomb, is an accurate description of both the geographic concentration and the cultural significance of the Neolithic monuments of the central mainland. The Ring of Brodger is a stone circle approximately 100 meters in diameter, originally comprising 60 standing stones of which 27 remain, built sometime around 2500 BCE and representing one of the largest stone circles in Britain. The stones of Stonehenge, a smaller but earlier circle of 12 large stones of which only 4 remain standing, dates to approximately 3100 BCE and is roughly contemporary with the earliest phases of occupation at Skara Brae. Maeshowe, a few kilometers from both stone circles, is a large chambered cairn whose interior chamber is precisely aligned to admit the light of the midwinter sunset, a feat of astronomical observation and architectural precision that ranks among the most impressive achievements of the Neolithic world. The specific relationship between the domestic site of Skara Brae and the ceremonial monuments of the heart of Neolithic Orkney is not one of simple geographic proximity, because the monuments are not adjacent to the village but are several kilometers distant, located near the isthmus between the lochs of Harry and Stenness. The relationship is better understood as one of cultural and social connection. The people of Skara Brae and the other Neolithic communities of Orkney would have participated in the ceremonies and gatherings associated with the monuments, traveling to the central landscape for events that brought together the dispersed communities of the archipelago and creating the social bonds that sustained cooperation across a larger territory than any single community could manage alone. The Ness of Brodger, a site between the Ring of Brodger and the Stones of Stenness that has been under excavation since 2003, has revealed the remains of a large complex of substantial stone buildings that appears to have functioned as a ceremonial and perhaps feasting center for the Neolithic communities of Orkney. The scale of the buildings at the Ness of Brodger, some of which are larger and more elaborately constructed than the domestic houses of Skara Brae, and the evidence for large-scale consumption of cattle that the excavations have revealed, suggest a site where communities came together for communal events of a scale that exceeded what any single settlement could organize independently. The Ring of Brodger and the Stones of Stenness represent the investment of enormous collective labor in the creation of ceremonial monuments that served the communities of Neolithic Orkney as foci for gatherings, ceremonies, and the shared expression of the values and beliefs that bound the communities of the archipelago together. The specific significance of the two circles, whether astronomical, calendrical, social, or cosmological, cannot be definitively established from the surviving evidence, but the investment they represent in the creation of permanent communal infrastructure documents a social organization capable of mobilizing large numbers of people for shared projects of a scale that goes well beyond subsistence farming. The astronomical alignments that have been identified at several of the Arcadian monuments, including the precise alignment of Mayshow's entrance passage to the midwinter sunset, suggest a systematic interest in the movements of celestial bodies and a capacity to encode that interest in permanent architectural form that implies a level of intellectual sophistication that the purely domestic evidence from Skara Brae alone would not lead one to predict. The specific astronomical observations required to achieve the precise midwinter alignment of Mayshow's entrance passage represent a significant intellectual achievement, requiring the systematic observation of the sun's position on the horizon over multiple years, the identification of the specific days on which the sunset fell at precisely the right point to illuminate the interior of the tomb, and the translation of that observational knowledge into the specific architectural decisions of the tomb's design and orientation. The capacity to make and record systematic astronomical observations, to use those observations in architectural design, and to execute that design with the precision required to achieve the desired astronomical effect is not a trivial achievement for a non-literate community using stone tools and relying entirely on direct visual observation. It suggests a tradition of systematic observation and record-keeping, perhaps through the use of alignment markers in the landscape, that we cannot directly document but that the achievement of Mayshow proves must have existed. The abandonment of Skara Brae, which occurred sometime around 2500 BCE, is one of the questions that the archaeological evidence has illuminated but not definitively answered, and the specific circumstances of the end of the settlement remain a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion. The traditional interpretation of the abandonment, which developed from the early excavations of the site in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, proposed that the settlement was abandoned suddenly, in the context of a violent storm that forced the inhabitants to leave in such haste that they left their personal possessions behind, including the string of beads that was found scattered on the floor of one of the houses as if dropped by a fleeing inhabitant. The story of the sudden storm and the fleeing inhabitants had obvious narrative appeal, and it was repeated in popular accounts of the site for generations. More recent analysis has qualified this picture considerably. The evidence for a gradual rather than sudden decline in occupation, visible in the changing character of the artifact assemblages and the building deposits in the later phases of the settlement's history, suggests that the abandonment of Skara Brae was not a single dramatic event but a process that unfolded over a period of time. The later houses show evidence of modification and repair that suggests continued occupation and adaptation rather than crisis, and the gradual accumulation of sand around and eventually over the buildings is consistent with a slow abandonment in which the community reduced in size over time before finally departing rather than a sudden exodus in a single dramatic event. The broader context of the abandonment is potentially as important as the specific circumstances. The period around 2500 BCE saw significant changes in the archaeological record of Orkney and of Britain more broadly, changes that are associated with the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age and with the arrival in Britain of people associated with the beaker culture, a phenomenon visible across Europe in the form of a distinctive type of pottery and a specific set of burial practices. Whether these broader changes were the direct cause of the abandonment of Skara Brae or simply coincided with it is uncertain, but the convergence of the end of the settlement with this period of broader cultural change suggests that the two phenomena are not entirely unrelated. The climatic context of the abandonment has also attracted scholarly attention. The period around 2500 BCE shows evidence in the paleoclimatic record for a deterioration in conditions in northern Britain, with increasing wetness and storminess that would have made life on the exposed Orkney coast more challenging. Whether this climatic change was severe enough to force the abandonment of a settlement that had been occupied for 6 centuries is debatable, but it may have been a contributing factor to the decision to leave a location that was becoming less hospitable over time. The broader cultural changes that accompanied the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age in Britain, including the arrival of beaker culture populations and the shift from communal to individual burial practice, represent one of the most significant transformations in British prehistory and one whose causes and mechanisms are still debated. The recent genetic analysis of Bronze Age British populations has shown that there was a significant influx of people from continental Europe associated with the beaker phenomenon, to the point where the genetic ancestry of the British population was substantially transformed over the course of a few centuries around 2500 to 2000 BCE. Whether this genetic transformation reflects a migration of populations, a movement of cultural practices accompanied by smaller numbers of people, or some combination, is a question whose answer has significant implications for how we understand the end of the Neolithic world of Skara Brae and the communities that followed it. The stone houses and the stone furniture of Skara Brae, the accumulated traditions of 6 centuries of domestic life on the shore of the Bay of Scaril, were abandoned at approximately the same time that these broader changes were reshaping the population and culture of Britain. The legacy of the Neolithic communities of Orkney in the landscape of the modern archipelago is considerable, and the specific relationship between the modern Arcadian population and the ancient monuments that surround them is one that combines local pride with the practical reality of living in a landscape where Neolithic structures are as common as later historical features. The farmers of Orkney have been plowing around and occasionally into Neolithic sites for millennia, and the specific relationship between agricultural practice and the preservation or destruction of archaeological sites that this long history of land use creates is one of the central management challenges for Orkney's remarkable archaeological heritage. The designation of the heart of Neolithic Orkney as a World Heritage Property has provided a framework for the protection of the most significant sites within the agricultural landscape, but the ongoing management of this protection in a working agricultural environment requires the active cooperation of Orkney's farming community. The discovery of Skara Brae and its subsequent archaeological investigation represent one of the most important chapters in the history of British archaeology, and the specific circumstances of the discovery, the personalities involved in its investigation, and the changing interpretations of the site over time reflect the development of the discipline as a whole. The exposure of the site by the storm of 1850 attracted the attention of William Graham Watt, the Laird of Scail House, whose estate included the shore of the Bay of Scail. Watt began excavating the exposed remains, and his work over the following years revealed several of the houses and their stone furniture, establishing the basic character of the site as a remarkable survival of prehistoric domestic architecture. Watt's excavations were conducted in the spirit of gentlemanly antiquarianism that characterized early Victorian archaeology, without the systematic documentation and stratigraphic awareness that later archaeological science would require, and a significant amount of information about the site's deposits and their contents was lost in the process. Nevertheless, Watt's work preserved the fabric of the structures from further erosion and made the site known to the broader scholarly community. The systematic archaeological investigation of Skara Brae began in earnest in 1924, when Vere Gordon Childe, then professor of prehistoric archaeology at the University of Edinburgh and later one of the most influential archaeologists of the 20th century, began excavations at the site that continued through 1930. Childe's work at Skara Brae was significant both for the specific new evidence it recovered and for the interpretive framework it established for understanding the site. Childe identified the full extent of the settlement, clarified the chronological relationship between the different structures, and placed Skara Brae within the broader context of Neolithic Europe that he was in the process of developing through his comprehensive synthetic work on prehistoric societies. The most recent comprehensive investigation of Skara Brae, carried out by Historic Scotland and the University of Edinburgh in the 1990s and early 2000s, used the full range of modern archaeological techniques, including systematic environmental sampling, radiocarbon dating, micromorphological analysis of floor deposits, and the study of the phytolith and pollen records preserved in the site's deposits, to produce a significantly more detailed picture of the settlement's occupation history and of the daily life of its inhabitants. The specific findings of this investigation, particularly the evidence for the gradual rather than sudden character of the site's abandonment and for the specific subsistence economy of the community, have significantly revised the understanding of the site that Childe's excavations established. Vere Gordon Childe was one of the most influential archaeological thinkers of the 20th century, and his interpretation of Skara Brae in the context of his broader comparative work on the Neolithic of Europe and the Near East remains one of the foundational frameworks for understanding the site. Childe's concept of the Neolithic Revolution, the transformation of human societies from mobile hunter-gatherer bands to settled agricultural communities, which he developed in part through his study of sites like Skara Brae, was one of the most important intellectual contributions to the study of prehistoric societies and remains influential despite the significant revisions that subsequent research has required. The specific application of this framework to Skara Brae, as a community of settled Neolithic farmers on the far northwestern edge of the farming revolution, gave the site a significance beyond its specific location and made it a key piece of evidence for the broader story of how farming transformed human society. The subsequent 6 decades of archaeological investigation at the site have confirmed and refined many aspects of Childe's interpretation while revising others, particularly the picture of sudden abandonment that his excavations suggested. The history of interpretation of Skara Brae since Childe's excavations reflects the broader theoretical development of prehistoric archaeology in Britain, from the culture-historical approach that Childe himself pioneered to the processual archaeology of the 1960s and 1970s, the post-processual approaches of the 1980s and 1990s, and the more recent combination of scientific and humanistic methods that characterizes the discipline today. Each of these theoretical frameworks has asked different questions of the evidence and has found different answers, and the cumulative effect of a century of changing theoretical perspectives applied to the same material evidence has been the production of a rich and multi-layered understanding of the site that no single framework could have achieved alone. The ongoing excavations at the adjacent and related Ness of Brodger site, which have been producing evidence that significantly changes the understanding of the social and ceremonial context within which Skara Brae existed, represent the most recent chapter in the ongoing story of Neolithic Orkney's place in the archaeological imagination of Britain. The story of Skara Brae is not finished. The sand that preserved it is still there, holding the unexcavated portions of the site against future investigation. The sea that threatens it is still there too, patient and relentless, doing what seas do. And the archaeology continues, adding detail and nuance to a picture of Neolithic life that was invisible before the storm of 1850 removed the sand and gave a 5,000-year-old village back to the living world. What is already known is remarkable. What remains to be learned is still waiting in the ground. Orkney keeps its secrets well, and gives them up slowly, one storm at a time. The storm of 1850 gave us Skara Brae. What the next one might uncover, no one can say. The material culture of Skara Brae, the specific objects that the inhabitants made and used and eventually left behind, provides a window into the intellectual and aesthetic life of the community that goes beyond the purely functional evidence for subsistence and economy. The decorated stone balls found at Skara Brae and at other Neolithic sites in Orkney are among the most intriguing artifacts from the period. These spherical stone objects, typically made from a variety of stone types including the local sandstone and imported stones from elsewhere in Scotland, are decorated with a range of incised patterns including spirals, lozenges, and other geometric designs that connect them to the broader tradition of Neolithic decorative art in Britain and Ireland. The specific function of the decorated stone balls is unknown. They are too small and too smooth to have been weapons. They show no evidence of use as tools, and the care taken in their manufacture and decoration suggests that they were objects of some significance beyond the purely utilitarian. The possibility that they were used in games, or in divination, or as tokens of social status or identity, has been proposed, but the evidence for any specific interpretation remains inconclusive. The ceramic assemblage from Skara Brae provides evidence both for the practical skills of the community and for their connections to the broader world of Neolithic Britain. The pottery of Skara Brae belongs to the grooved ware tradition, a distinctive type of decorated pottery that first appears in Orkney around 3100 BCE and subsequently spreads southward through Britain over the following centuries, eventually becoming the dominant pottery tradition of Neolithic Britain by approximately 2800 BCE. The apparent origin of grooved ware in Orkney and its subsequent spread to the rest of Britain is one of the more striking pieces of evidence for the cultural influence that this remote archipelago had on the broader world of Neolithic Britain, suggesting that the communities of Orkney were not merely recipients of cultural innovations developed elsewhere, but were active participants in and contributors to the cultural networks of the period. The evidence for the production of textiles at Skara Brae, preserved in the form of bone needles and awls and possible loom weights, adds a dimension to the picture of domestic life that the stone furniture and the food remains alone cannot provide. The Neolithic inhabitants of Skara Brae wore clothing and probably produced textiles from the wool of their sheep and possibly from plant fibers as well, and the specific tools of textile production found at the site document a craft that was an integral part of the household economy even if the textiles themselves have long since decomposed. The ornaments found at Skara Brae, including pendants and beads made from materials including animal bone, tooth, and shell, provide evidence for personal decoration practices that add another dimension to the picture of the community's aesthetic life. Some of the ornaments are made from materials that were not locally available, including whale and walrus bone and the shells of species not found in Orkney waters, documenting exchange connections that reached beyond the immediate environment of the Bay of Scaril. The specifically personal character of ornaments, which are worn on the body and express individual identity in ways that communal monuments cannot, gives them a particular significance for understanding the social life of the community. The specific beads and pendants that the Skara Brae inhabitants wore documented their identities and their social connections in a visible and daily form, and the specific necklace whose beads were scattered on the floor of one of the houses at the time of its abandonment is one of the most evocative personal objects from the Neolithic world, a trace of an individual personality within the collective archaeological record of the community. The specific analysis of the human skeletal remains from Neolithic Orkney, which are held primarily in the chambered tombs rather than in domestic contexts like Skara Brae, has provided important information about the health, diet, and physical characteristics of the people who built and inhabited the settlement. The dental evidence shows patterns of wear consistent with a diet that included both gritty grain foods and tough animal products, and the specific patterns of dental decay and wear are consistent with the dietary reconstruction from the faunal and plant remains at Skara Brae itself. The skeletal evidence for physical stress patterns, including changes in bone morphology associated with specific types of repetitive activity, documents the specific physical demands of the agricultural and pastoral work that was the primary economic activity of the community. and the evidence for pathological conditions, including arthritis and injuries, provides a window into the specific health challenges of life in the Neolithic Arcadian environment. The Neolithic people of Orkney and their relationship with the dead is one of the most revealing dimensions of the cultural life of the period, and the specific evidence for funerary practice in Neolithic Orkney helps to illuminate the beliefs and the social organization of the communities who built Skara Brae. The primary evidence for Neolithic funerary practice in Orkney comes from the chambered tombs, the large stone-built structures in which the remains of the dead were deposited over extended periods of time. These tombs, of which Maeshowe is the most architecturally impressive example and the Tomb of the Eagles on South Ronaldsay is the richest in terms of the skeletal material it has yielded, are collective burial structures in which the bones of multiple individuals, sometimes spanning several generations, were deposited, rearranged, and eventually mingled in a way that dissolved the individuality of the dead into a collective ancestral presence. The Tomb of the Eagles, excavated in the 1970s, yielded the remains of more than 300 individuals deposited over a period of approximately 800 years, along with the bones of white-tailed sea eagles that gave the tomb its modern name. The mixing and rearrangement of bones that the excavation documented suggests that the tomb was periodically reopened and its contents reorganized, with specific bones, particularly skulls and long bones, selected and moved while others remained in place. This treatment of the dead is characteristic of the Neolithic communal tomb tradition across Britain and Ireland, and reflects a specific understanding of death as a process of transformation in which the individual gradually became part of the collective ancestral community, rather than maintaining a separate post-mortem identity. The specific relationship between the Skara Brae community and the dead of Orkney is not directly documented, because no burials have been found within the settlement itself. But the community would have participated in the rituals associated with the chambered tombs and with the larger monument complex of the heart of Neolithic Orkney, and the specific beliefs about the dead and the ancestors that the tomb tradition reflects were almost certainly part of the cultural framework within which the people of Skara Brae understood their own lives and deaths. The long barrows and cairns that the Orkney landscape are the permanent monuments of a community whose relationship with its dead was central to its social and spiritual life. The white-tailed sea eagle, whose bones were deposited alongside human remains in the Tomb of the Eagles on South Ronaldsay, is a species that was widespread in Neolithic Britain and that would have been a regular presence in the skies above Skara Brae, hunting the fish in the Bay of Scail and the small mammals of the Arcadian moorland. The specific association of the eagle with the dead in the Neolithic funerary tradition of Orkney is one of the more intriguing aspects of the period's spiritual life, suggesting a relationship between this particular species and the realm of the dead or the ancestors that we cannot fully reconstruct, but that clearly had deep cultural significance for the communities of Neolithic Orkney. The eagle's combination of aerial perspective, predatory power, and scavenging behavior, which would have made it a regular visitor to exposed burial grounds, may have contributed to its association with the transition between the living and the dead. Whatever the specific belief that connected the eagle to the funerary tradition, it was one that was maintained consistently across the period of Neolithic Orkney's greatest cultural development. The concept of the ancestral community, in which the bones of the dead members of the group remained present within the landscape as participants in the ongoing life of the community, is one that the evidence from the Neolithic tombs of Orkney and indeed of Britain more broadly strongly supports. The periodic reopening of the chambered tombs to add new burials and rearrange existing bones suggests a relationship with the dead that was not simply reverential but actively maintained, in which the dead continued to be members of the community in a meaningful sense long after their individual deaths. The specific rituals associated with this relationship, the ceremonies at the tomb entrance, the selection and rearrangement of particular bones, the offerings that may have been deposited with the remains, are recoverable only in their material traces and not in their spoken or symbolic content. But their existence is clear from the evidence, and the specific investment that the Neolithic communities of Orkney made in building and maintaining the elaborate chambered tombs that the archipelago was an investment in the management of the relationship between the living and the dead that was central to their social and spiritual lives. The preservation conditions at Skara Brae are exceptional by the standards of Neolithic archaeology, and the specific reasons for this exceptional preservation illuminate both the fortunate accident of the site's burial and the ongoing conservation challenges that its exposure and visitor impact have created. The primary mechanism of preservation at Skara Brae was burial under dry sand, a medium that excludes oxygen and moisture in a way that slows the biological decay processes that destroy organic material and that allows the physical structures of buildings and their contents to survive largely intact. The sand that buried Skara Brae did so gradually, accumulating around and over the buildings over centuries and eventually reaching sufficient depth to stabilize the structures beneath it. The same sand that ended the occupation of the site, by making it progressively less habitable, was also the agent of its preservation, creating the conditions under which the stone furniture and the stone architecture would survive for 5,000 years. The exposure of the site since the storm of 1850, first through the antiquarian excavations of the Victorian period and then through the more systematic excavations of the 20th century, has subjected the surviving structures to environmental conditions that are significantly more destructive than the burial conditions that had preserved them. The stone walls of the houses, exposed to the Orkney wind and rain and the salt spray from the adjacent bay of Scaril, have deteriorated significantly since their exposure to the elements following the excavations of the Victorian and early 20th century periods, and the specific processes of freeze-thaw cycling, salt crystallization, and biological colonization that affect the stone surfaces in the exposed condition are gradually degrading the structure of the walls. The management of this degradation is one of the primary conservation challenges at the site, and the specific interventions that have been applied, including protective coatings for the stone surfaces and drainage systems to manage the water that accumulates around the structures, are ongoing responses to the fundamental problem of preserving in an exposed condition a structure that was designed to exist in a protected one. The visitor management challenge at Skara Brae, which receives several 100,000 visitors per year, is also significant. The physical impact of visitor traffic on the turf and the unexcavated deposits surrounding the exposed structures, and the vibration and air disturbance caused by large numbers of people moving around the viewing platforms above the houses, are forms of damage whose cumulative effect is difficult to quantify but that are recognized as a genuine conservation concern. The development of the visitor infrastructure that allows access to the site while minimizing physical contact with the structures has been one of the major projects of the site's managers over the past several decades. The specific challenges of conservation at a coastal site like Skara Brae are compounded by the ongoing processes of coastal erosion that are affecting the Bay of Scaril and many other Arcadian coastlines. The combination of rising sea levels, increasingly severe storm events, and the inherently unstable nature of sand dune environments creates a dynamic situation in which the physical position of the coastline is gradually changing and in which the unexcavated portions of the Skara Brae site, which extend beyond the currently visible cluster of houses, may be threatened by erosion over the coming decades. The development of a long-term strategy for the management of the site in the context of climate change, which is affecting the Arcadian coastline with a particular severity given Orkney's exposure to the full force of the North Atlantic, is one of the more pressing issues facing the management of this exceptional heritage site and one that has implications beyond Skara Brae for the management of coastal archaeological sites worldwide. The role of Skara Brae in the tourism economy of Orkney is significant and has grown substantially over the past several decades as the site's profile has been raised through the UNESCO World Heritage designation and through increased popular interest in Neolithic archaeology. The site typically receives several 100,000 visitors per year, a substantial number for a remote island archipelago, and the economic impact of this visitor traffic on the local economy of Orkney is considerable. The management of the tension between the commercial opportunities that tourism creates and the conservation imperatives that the fragility of the site demands is one that the site's managers navigate carefully, and the specific decisions about visitor infrastructure, access arrangements, and interpretation that have been made at Skara Brae represent a model for the management of heritage tourism at sensitive archaeological sites that has been studied and referenced by managers at sites around the world. The experience of visiting Skara Brae, which is managed by Historic Environment Scotland as one of the country's premier archaeological attractions, is one that the specific qualities of the site, its coastal location, its state of preservation, and the specific character of what has been uncovered, make unlike almost any other archaeological site in Britain. The approach to the site from the car park and visitor centre passes through the grounds of Scarhill House, the 17th-century mansion that occupies the shore of the bay, and along the edge of the bay itself, where the Atlantic is visible and audible in a way that immediately establishes the specific coastal character of the site. The wind is almost always present at Skara Brae, and it is a wind with a specific quality, salty and direct, coming across the open water with nothing between Orkney and North America to slow it down. It is possible to understand, feeling this wind on the approach to the site, something about the specific challenge that the Neolithic community chose to accept when they settled on the shore of the Bay of Scarhill. The houses are encountered from above, from the viewing paths that surround the cluster of structures without allowing visitors to enter the houses themselves. This elevated viewpoint, looking down into the interiors of the structures, provides the specific perspective that makes Skara Brae so immediately legible. The dresser on the back wall, the hearth in the middle of the floor, the box beds on either side, the storage containers sunk into the floor. From this viewpoint, the houses communicate their original function with an immediacy that most archaeological sites achieve only after extensive interpretation. The specific sensory experience of visiting Skara Brae in different weather conditions varies dramatically. On a clear Orkney summer day, with the blue bay visible beyond the site and the Atlantic light making every stone surface vivid and distinct, the site has a quality of almost uncomfortable beauty, the ancient stone catching the sun in a landscape whose colors, the green of the turf, the gray of the stone, the blue of the water, are unusually saturated in the clear northern air. In stormy weather, with the waves breaking on the shore a few meters from the site and the wind making it difficult to stand upright, the sense of the specific environmental challenge that the Neolithic community faced becomes much more visceral, and the specifically sheltered character of the semi-subterranean houses, buried in their midden and insulated from the wind, makes much more immediate sense. The museum adjacent to the site provides the interpretive context that the site itself, visible but not accessible in its interior, cannot supply directly. The reconstructed house interior in the museum, built to scale and furnished with replicas of the stone furniture, allows the visitor to stand at floor level within a Skara Brae house and to experience the specific scale and the specific organization of the space in a way that the elevated viewpoint of the site itself does not permit. The specific intimacy of the reconstructed space, the low ceiling, the central hearth, the dresser on the back wall, produces a quality of imaginative access to the Neolithic domestic world that is different in character from but complementary to the experience of seeing the actual remains. The visitor interpretation at Skara Brae has evolved significantly since the site was first opened to the public, reflecting both the advances in archaeological understanding of the site and the broader development of heritage interpretation as a professional discipline. The early interpretation of the site, which emphasized the drama of the discovery and the sudden abandonment, has been revised to incorporate the more nuanced picture of the site's occupation and end that modern archaeology has produced. The development of the Scarhill House Museum and Visitor Center adjacent to the site, which opened in the early 2000s, significantly improved the quality of the interpretation available to visitors and provided a covered space for the display of objects from the site alongside the reconstructed house interior. The integration of the site into the heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Property, which also encompasses the Ring of Brodger, the stones of Stenness, and Maeshowe, has placed it within a broader interpretive context that communicates its significance as part of a landscape rather than as an isolated monument. The specific combination of the domestic, the ceremonial, and the funerary dimensions of Neolithic life that is visible in the heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Property makes it one of the most comprehensive records of Neolithic community life available anywhere in the world. The domestic evidence of Skara Brae, the ceremonial evidence of the Ring of Brodger and the stones of Stenness, and the funerary evidence of Maeshowe together provide a picture of a community whose life was organized around all three dimensions simultaneously, and whose physical landscape was shaped by the specific investments it made in each. The specific challenge of communicating this integrated picture to visitors, who may arrive at any one of the four sites without having visited the others and who may not have the background knowledge to understand how the different types of monument relate to each other, is one that the interpretation program of the World Heritage Property continues to address through coordinated signage, shared publications, and the development of itineraries that encourage visitors to experience the multiple sites in a sequence that communicates their relationships. The question of what Skara Brae reveals about the inner life of its inhabitants, the beliefs, the values, the aesthetic sensibilities, and the social relationships of a community that left no written records, is one that the archaeological evidence can approach but never fully answer, and the specific limits of that approach are as instructive as the knowledge it provides. The decorated stone balls and the incised art found at Skara Brae and other Neolithic Orkney sites suggest aesthetic sensibilities and a tradition of making objects for reasons that go beyond the purely functional, but they do not tell us what those objects meant to the people who made them. The consistent layout of the houses, with the dresser facing the entrance in each one, suggests a shared cultural convention about the organization of domestic space, but it does not tell us whether the dresser was a display space for valued possessions, a ritual focus for domestic ceremony, or simply a convenient piece of furniture whose consistent placement reflected the practical logic of the house plan. The specific objects placed in the dresser, which are entirely unknown since no object has been found in situ on a Skara Brae dresser, are perhaps the most tantalizing of the unknowns at the site. Whatever was displayed there, if anything was displayed at all, was important enough to warrant a piece of furniture of this scale and prominence in each house of the settlement, visible to everyone who entered, occupying the most prominent position in the domestic space. Whether the objects were tools, vessels, ornaments, or objects of symbolic significance that had no everyday function, they were part of a domestic visual world whose specific character is irretrievably lost. What the archaeological evidence does reveal is a community that was materially comfortable within the constraints of its environment, that invested significant time and skill in the construction and maintenance of its domestic infrastructure, that practiced a subsistence economy well adapted to the specific resources of the Orkney coastal environment, and that was connected to the broader social and cultural world of Neolithic Orkney and, through the networks of the period, to the wider world of Neolithic Britain. The specific quality of that connection, the nature of the relationships between the Skara Brae community and its neighbors, the content of the ceremonies in which it participated, the stories it told about its origins and its place in the world, are all beyond recovery. But the physical remains of the daily life that the community conducted in these stone houses, the beds and the hearths and the dressers and the tools and the food remains, are a form of testimony that 5,000 years of burial and 2 centuries of archaeology have preserved with unusual completeness. The question of what the Skara Brae inhabitants called themselves, what language they spoke, what stories they told about their origins and their place in the world, is entirely beyond the reach of archaeology and will remain so unless some form of written record is discovered, which seems vanishingly unlikely given the Neolithic date of the settlement. The absence of linguistic evidence means that the entire dimension of the community's cultural life that was expressed through language, which in any human community is one of the richest and most important dimensions of cultural life, is irretrievably lost. The songs, the prayers, the myths, the genealogies, the technical knowledge transmitted through spoken instruction, the social norms encoded in proverbs and stories, are all gone without a trace. What remains are the objects and the structures, the material expression of a cultural life whose spoken dimension we will never hear. This fundamental asymmetry between what material culture can and cannot preserve is one of the central challenges of prehistoric archaeology, and Skara Brae, for all its exceptional preservation, is ultimately no exception to it. The practice of isotopic analysis applied to the bones of Neolithic individuals from Orkney has provided information about their diet and their geographic origins that the conventional archaeological evidence alone could not supply. The analysis of strontium and oxygen isotopes from tooth enamel, which reflects the specific chemical composition of the water and food available in the geographic area where an individual grew up, can identify individuals who were not born in the area where they were buried, providing evidence for the movement of people between communities during the Neolithic period. The analysis of nitrogen and carbon isotopes from bone collagen provides information about the proportions of different food sources in the diet, distinguishing between the consumption of marine and terrestrial protein in ways that complement the faunal evidence from the middens. These isotopic analyses have begun to reveal the specific patterns of mobility and diet in Neolithic Orkney in ways that significantly enrich the understanding of the community beyond what the structural and artifactual evidence alone can provide. The place of Skara Brae in the broader story of human prehistory, and the specific lessons that its exceptional preservation allows for the understanding of Neolithic life more generally, are dimensions of the site's significance that extend beyond its specific location on the shores of the Bay of Scaril. Skara Brae matters for the prehistory of Britain in several distinct ways. It is the best preserved example of domestic Neolithic architecture in Britain, and possibly in Northern Europe, providing a standard of comparison for the interpretation of the much less complete domestic remains found at other sites of the period. The specific information about the organization of Neolithic domestic space, the role of stone furniture in houses that could not use wood, and the relationship between domestic buildings and the midden deposits that surrounded them, has informed the interpretation of Neolithic sites across Britain and has revised the understanding of Neolithic domestic life in ways that would not have been possible without the specific evidence of Skara Brae. The site also matters for the understanding of Neolithic social organization more broadly. The evidence from Skara Brae for a closely integrated community with a high degree of shared convention about domestic life, connected to a broader ceremonial landscape through the monuments of the heart of Neolithic Orkney, provides one model of how Neolithic communities organized their social lives that complements and enriches the evidence from the funeral monuments and the ceremonial sites that have traditionally dominated the understanding of the period. Neolithic archaeology has historically been more successful at understanding the ceremonial and funerary dimensions of the period than its domestic dimensions, partly because the monuments are visible and the domestic sites are not, and Skara Brae provides an important corrective to this bias. The site also raises profound questions about the nature of human diversity in the Neolithic period and about the specific conditions that made the extraordinary preservation of Skara Brae possible. The Neolithic communities of Britain lived in a wide variety of environmental conditions and developed a wide variety of specific adaptations to those conditions, and the specific form of Neolithic life visible at Skara Brae, with its stone furniture and its semi-subterranean houses buried in midden deposits, was a specific solution to the specific challenges of the Orkney environment that would not have been appropriate or possible in most other parts of Britain. Understanding Skara Brae as a specific adaptation to a specific environment rather than as a typical example of Neolithic British life is essential for using its evidence appropriately. The UNESCO World Heritage designation that encompasses Skara Brae as part of the heart of Neolithic Orkney property recognizes both the exceptional character of the individual monuments and the significance of their relationship to each other in a unified landscape. The specific decision to designate the four sites as a group rather than as individual monuments reflects an understanding of the Neolithic Orkney landscape as a unified cultural achievement rather than a collection of separate sites, and it provides the framework for a management approach that treats the whole landscape as the object of conservation rather than simply its individual elements. The development of coordinated interpretation across the four sites of the World Heritage property, which has been an ongoing project of Historic Environment Scotland, has significantly improved the visitor's understanding of the relationships between the domestic and the ceremonial dimensions of Neolithic Orkney life, and has made the heart of Neolithic Orkney one of the most well-interpreted UNESCO World Heritage properties in Britain. The international significance of Skara Brae within the broader story of human prehistory is recognized not only through its UNESCO designation, but through its inclusion in the curriculum of archaeology and prehistory courses at universities around the world. The site features in discussions of Neolithic social organization, of the archaeology of domestic space, of the exceptional preservation of prehistoric material culture, and of the specific environmental conditions that allow certain types of archaeological evidence to survive while others are lost. The scholarly literature on Skara Brae is extensive and continues to grow, with new studies examining specific aspects of the site's evidence from new theoretical and methodological perspectives, and the site continues to attract visiting researchers whose work adds incrementally to the comprehensive understanding of the settlement that has been built up over more than a century of systematic investigation. The ethical dimensions of archaeological investigation at Skara Brae, and particularly the question of the relationship between archaeological research and the living communities who are the cultural descendants of the Neolithic inhabitants, are ones that have become increasingly prominent in the discipline over the past few decades. There are no direct descendants of the Skara Brae community in the way that there are descendants of more recent historical communities, because the genetic and cultural continuity between the Neolithic inhabitants and the modern Arcadian population has been broken and transformed by more than 4,000 years of subsequent immigration, cultural change, and population replacement. Nevertheless, the modern Arcadian community has a genuine and meaningful relationship with the Neolithic monuments of their archipelago, one of ownership and stewardship and local identity, and the management of that relationship between the local community, the archaeological research community, and the heritage management authorities is an ongoing and productive negotiation. Skara Brae stands on the shore of the Bay of Scaril, its stone houses open to the sky for the first time in 5,000 years, preserved by the same sand that ended the settlement and now gradually succumbing to the weather and the time that the sand had protected them from. The village was built to be permanent. The stone furniture was built to last. The community that constructed these houses and lived in them for 6 centuries, that buried its dead in the great chambered tombs of the archipelago and participated in the ceremonies at the Ring of Brodger and the Stones of Stenness, was building a life that it expected to continue indefinitely, rooted in the specific landscape of the Bay of Scaril and connected to the broader social world of Neolithic Orkney. And then, for reasons that are not entirely clear, the village was abandoned, the sand accumulated, and the memory of the place faded into the general oblivion that awaits all human settlements that are not written about. What the storm of 1850 uncovered was not a monument built to survive, but a home that happened to survive. The difference matters. The great ceremonial monuments of Neolithic Orkney, the Ring of Brodger, the Stones of Stenness, Maeshowe, were built with the intention of permanence, using the largest stones that the community could quarry and transport and erect in the most durable architectural form available. They were built to be seen and to endure. Skara Brae was built to be lived in, and the stone furniture and the stone houses were expressions of the specific practical logic of a community that had sandstone but no wood, and that built from what it had. The permanence of Skara Brae was accidental, a consequence of the sand that buried it rather than of any intention to preserve it for posterity. And yet it has lasted longer than almost anything else from its time. The dressed stone of the Egyptian pyramids, built by a civilization that was explicitly constructing monuments for eternity, has survived the 5,000 years since its construction because it was designed to do so. The stone hearth of a Skara Brae house, built by a family for their own warmth and not for any posterity, has survived the same 5,000 years for exactly the opposite reason. Not because it was designed to last, but because it was hidden from the forces that would have destroyed it. The two types of survival, the intentional and the accidental, produce very different types of knowledge about the past. The pyramids tell us about Egyptian kings and their theological beliefs. The hearth of a Skara Brae house tells us about an Arcadian family sitting together at the center of their home. Both kinds of knowledge matter. The monumental and the domestic, the permanent and the accidental, the intentional and the fortunate. These are the two registers in which the human past leaves its traces, and the great sites of history are those that speak to us in both registers simultaneously. Skara Brae speaks to us primarily in the domestic register, the register of the hearth and the bed and the dresser and the daily meal, and it speaks in that register with an intimacy and a specificity that the great monuments, for all their grandeur, cannot match. What the storm of 1850 returned to the world was not simply another ancient building but a specific community's specific home, the actual physical environment in which specific people lived their actual lives. We do not know their names. We do not know their language. We do not know what they thought or believed or feared or hoped for. But we know what their houses looked like from the inside. We know where they slept. We know what they ate. We know that they kept their dresser facing the door and their fire in the center of the room. And in knowing these things, we know something about what it was to be human in their time and their place that the great monuments, for all their impressiveness, will never tell us. The hearth is still there. It has been there for 5,000 years, and it will be there tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, patient and specific and indifferent to the passage of time in the way that only stone can be. The fire that once burned in it is long gone, but the shape of the space that held it is unchanged. And somewhere in that shape, if we know how to look, there is still a family, still warm. But on a quiet night, listening to the wind off the Bay of Scaril and thinking about the family that once sat around that hearth, it is the second kind that feels closer and more real. The kings are gone and their monuments remain. The family is gone too, and so are all their words and all their thoughts and all their names. But the hearth is still there, and the dresser faces the door. And 5,000 years is just the gap between them and us, which the stone, patient and specific, has bridged. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.